Invitation. It's great to see everybody. Also great to see Krista from my neighborhood. And if you don't have her book, you need to get it. But I'm here representing the Detroit chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace. I'm very grateful for the invitation. You've heard something about JVP in the very generous introduction. JVP started out in California as a local group in, I believe, 1996. And as it was becoming a national organization, our Detroit chapter formed in 2005 and has been active since then. Since October 7th, JVP nationally and certainly in Detroit has been growing, I have to say, explosively, both in terms of our activist core and in the activities we carry out. The principles on which JVP is organized are basically a commitment to the principles of equal justice, equal security, and equal peace for Israelis and Palestinians. That's the principle. What that's going to look like in terms of drawing a map, not my thing. I don't have the competence to do that. That has to be done on the ground when the barriers and the obstacles to peace and justice are removed, or at least significantly turned back. Now, in the disastrous 6 months since October 7th, the 6 months of the killings on October 7th, and then the genocide in Gaza, I'm sure you follow it extensively, but there's a few things to say about it. It's not the first genocide in recent times by any means. It's not the only genocide going on right now, but it's the first genocide in history that is live streamed. Okay, and that poses both a trauma and a tremendous moral challenge because you can't turn away from it. The other thing about it, that while Palestine has undergone a whole series of historical disasters, this is the first fully joint U.S.-Israeli genocide. Okay, that is, the United States has been backing Israel more and more, especially since 1967. But in this case, the United States is a full and complete participant in what's going on. And for people who don't like the word genocide, and in some quarters it's considered, a terrible thing to say, treif, as you say in Hebrew, or haram in Arabic. The truth is that if you look at the United Nations Convention on the Prevention of Genocide, and you look at Article 2, there are 5 criteria for what constitutes genocide. That is the attempt to destroy in whole or part a national, religious, or ethnic, or some identifiable group. And you can see that 4 of the 5 correspond exactly to what Israel, with full U.S. support, is doing in Gaza. If you want to know what the 5th one is, the 5th one is kidnapping of children. Okay, that's what Vladimir Putin has been indicted for by the International Criminal Court, but that's a separate thing. The other 4 criteria, and you can look them up, fully correspond to what's happening in Gaza. Now, as I'm sure you know, because when we talk about things like this, I believe we always have to start. We really have to start at home. We have to start with ourselves. As I'm sure you know, there are huge attacks on Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim community activity and activism, including horrible attacks on campus freedom of speech and activity in support of Palestine. I'm sure you know about the situation at U of M with the attempt to impose this absolutely, I have to say, illegal and unconstitutional attack on so-called obstruction of activity. You can just imagine the breadth to which that could be applied. So you know what's happening at the University of Michigan, I'm sure, and in many other places it's much worse. There is a severe rise throughout throughout our society in both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, that is, attacks on Muslims and sometimes people who aren't Muslims, but who some people think look like Muslims, and on Jews. Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, both forms of racism, which always, frankly, go together. Okay, when racism rises up and shows its head in this country, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are always go along for the ride. And we see that in all kinds of political expressions. Now, as far as talking about Jewish Voice for Peace and what we do and the movement that we're a part of, one thing I like to say in Jewish Voice for Peace is that we plead guilty to the charge that the day of October 7th, on October 8th, we refuse to forget everything that we knew on October 6th. As many progressive folks in our Jewish community, in our churches, in progressive circles and so on, all of a sudden they forgot what they knew on October 6th. There for a long time had been a real degenerative spiral of violence against Palestinians, an escalation of violence in the West Bank. Gaza, since 2007, had been turned into what is often called the world's largest open-air prison, and there's a lot of truth to that. But I don't totally like that, because calling it an open-air prison tends to hide from us the fact that it's also a society with families, with institutions, with a medical system, with a medical care system, with universities, and other kinds of social service institutions built up by people in Gaza under very difficult and trying circumstances. And that is what has now been destroyed, physically destroyed, socially destroyed, reduced to famine. We refuse to forget what we knew on October 6th, that this was all building up. And what we saw on October 8th, when we saw what Israeli government officials, to say nothing of the extreme right wing and the settlers, the overt Nazi types like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich were saying, when we heard what Israeli political and military officers were saying, we are dealing with human animals and we will act accordingly. There are no innocent civilians in Gaza. We will block everything. Nothing will get in, nothing will go out. No food, no electricity, no water. Okay? When we heard them say those things, we knew what it meant. We knew what that meant, both from our overall understanding of what that kind of rhetoric means. That was the rhetoric, for example, of the Rwanda genocide in 1994. And we also know it from specific occurrences in Jewish history. We knew what that meant. We knew that it pointed towards genocide. And we were not afraid to say that from the very first day. We saw it coming. And even though United States government officials either didn't know or pretended not to know, because I can't believe that they're all that stupid, not to understand what that kind of rhetoric means, we knew what was coming. And JVP began responding to that immediately, along with others. The other thing that I like to emphasize is that what we are doing makes a difference. And here, when I say what we are doing, by we, I don't just mean Jewish Voice for Peace. I mean the entire movement, mass outcry in this country and globally, demanding an immediate ceasefire. There are other Jewish groups like If Not Now. There are many peace organizations. There are the Palestinian and Arab community organizations. You know many of them. And when I say what we are doing makes a difference, is that the outcry for a ceasefire has moved the needle. Not nearly enough and not nearly fast enough. But we are not just crying in the wilderness. And I like to emphasize that because it often seems that the situation is hopeless. When we demand an immediate ceasefire, that doesn't mean that a ceasefire would solve the fundamental problems, which I don't think I need to elaborate on here. But this war is not solving any fundamental problems. This war is making everything worse. This, quite frankly, is not a war that Gaza or Palestine can win. That doesn't necessarily mean that Israel will win. There are wars that nobody wins. You can go in a different context to the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. Terribly destructive wars for both societies. Nobody won. What's happening in Israel is something that's also important to pay attention to, because there has been a political crisis in Israel. It is now resurfacing. What's driving this war is not only the long-term aim of the Zionist movement to basically eradicate Palestinian life. It's also driven by the short-term needs of the Netanyahu coalition to hold itself together. Because if that coalition falls, Netanyahu goes on trial and probably goes to jail. So he needs to be in power in order to keep himself from being prosecuted and imprisoned. If that sounds vaguely familiar to something that might be going on here, well, you can draw your own conclusions. But it's driven by all of that. And the destruction of Gaza is beyond belief. But also inside Israel, that political crisis is resurfacing. And I believe that it is likely to take on a violent form, because one of the far-right Israeli government ministers, you may know his name, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's in charge of the West Bank settlers, he has handed out thousands of automatic rifles to the settlers. Those are being used, and this goes under the radar screen. It's not covered nearly enough. These are being used on Palestinian villagers, 16 of which have already been basically forced to, abandon their villages in the West Bank. And as the crisis in Israel polarizes, it will be used in Israel's internal conflicts as well. So the situation is very extreme. And I'm not even getting into here, I'm deliberately leaving out the camp with Israel and Iran. If we want to talk about that, we can get it into the discussion. But even without that, the situation is desperate, almost beyond description. I think you all know that, and that is what we are attempting to respond to. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Can we take a couple of questions? Any questions from the audience? I have a question first, David. As far as the Jewish community, is there any statistic on how diverse are the opinions within it regarding the war?
Well, yes, and I have to say, when you talk about the Jewish community in the United States, it is quite diverse, and there's left, center, and right. But what's happening in Jewish public opinion, is not something separate from what is happening in the United States as a whole. Okay, there is majority sentiment in this country among the general population for a ceasefire. Within the Democratic Party voting base, that sentiment is overwhelming. and the Jewish community is not the Jewish community is not something separate from that. Of course, there's a polarization. Okay, there are forces in the Jewish community who think that Israel should, quote, finish the job. Okay, and you hear that. You actually hear that more from the extreme fundamentalist Christian, evangelical Christian sector than you do from Jews. Although that sentiment does exist. But I would say by now that there is probably, and I don't have immediate polling figures. I think there is a majority Jewish opinion in this country that wants this thing to end, okay? Even though it's not clear and is in favor of stopping the bloodshed and bringing it to an end. Although I think it's fair to say that people are very conflicted and confused as to how to do that.
Thank you. Any other question?
So, is this mic on, or should I just project my voice? Okay.
No, it's just for the...
Okay. So, do you have any suggestions to where you think people could better educate themselves or receive their news? Because obviously, here in America, the American media outlets are not super consistent or honest with what really is going on. So, like for example, I look at Al Jazeera often, but when you shared that they're supplying thousands of weapons to settlers in the West Bank, like that's something that I hadn't heard yet before, even with as much research as I've been doing. So I just wanted to know if you had any suggestions as to where we could learn more.
Right. Well, of course, Al Jazeera is good, which is why the Israeli government has banned it in Israel. And of course, there are tremendously brave journalists in Palestine and Gaza who are being targeted. I believe close to 200 now have been killed in what are obviously, deliberate military operations. There's an Israeli online magazine called Plus 972. 972 is that's their television, that's their telephone code. That's why look up Plus 972. They have a lot of coverage. Okay. In terms of regular media, I do listen to the BBC World Service News Hour. You get better coverage on BBC than you do on most American media. I'm not up watching TV late at night, but I understand that late at night, like after midnight, CNN International does a lot of good coverage. Okay, that you don't see, that you don't really see. I'm really struck when I look at cable news. I mean, they're occasionally, for example, look at MSNBC. Occasionally, they do some very striking reporting, but they're heavy hitters like Lawrence O'Donnell. If you want to go to a total Gaza-free and Palestine-free zone, just watch them from 10 to 11. You'll be amazed. You'll get all the updates on the Trump trial, and you'll get the infomercial for whatever Democratic candidate is running for whatever. But you will never see anything. Okay, so and of course, MSNBC got rid of Mehdi Hassan, who was their most powerful pro-Palestinian voice. So you're right about the media. But look at Plus 972. Look at Al Jazeera, look at Jadalia. And I also subscribe to Haaretz, which gives you a pretty good picture of the disastrous state of Israeli politics if you want to get if you want to get deep into those weeds.
Thank you. We can take one more question. Yes.
So I know Jewish Voice for Peace is really working hard to kind of challenge the conflation of criticism of Israeli policy and
Anti-Semitism.
anti-Semitism. Thank you. And I just wonder if you could talk about how successful that is, and also given the crackdown on campuses and in the employment arena, and then how that translates into change on the ground in Israeli society, given that I think it's like over 90% of Jewish Israelis think that the military effort in Gaza isn't going far enough. So how do we translate the incredible work that the Jewish community is doing here and allies to change on the ground in Israeli society?
Okay, well, there were a couple of folks here from a group in Israel called Standing Together, which is a group of it consists of both Jewish Israelis and Palestinian citizens of Israel, what are called sometimes the 48 Palestinians, and they work together to against the attacks that are going on Palestinian communities and so on. And I asked them, what is it that Jewish Israeli citizens see in their media? If they get their news from TV and they don't read Plus 972 and Haaretz and things like that. And the answer was, they get their news from TV and they don't see what's going on in Gaza. They see, the brave IDF soldiers. They don't see what's happening in Gaza. That will break through. That's not something we can really do, but it will break through, okay? There are very good journalists in Israel, both Palestinian and Jewish journalists. People like Amira Haas, Gideon Levy. But in terms of anti-Semitism and this conflation that you're talking about, one of the weapons that the Israel apologists and the Zionist movement use is a document called from something called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, talking about what anti-Semitism is. And it says, of course, many of the right things, contempt for Jews as a people, as a race, all that kind of thing. And then it says, denial of the right of Jewish self-determination. Well, this is completely false, because while there is certainly an Israeli Jewish nation, the Jews of the world are not a collective political entity, not a nation, okay? So this is weaponizing the charge of anti-Semitism in order to make it practically illegal to criticize, let alone condemn, Zionism as an Israeli, as a Jewish supremacist force. There is an alternative, a document written specifically as an alternative to the IHRA, which you can look up. It's called the Jerusalem Declaration. And it's much more solid. It's not necessarily perfect, but it's much more solid. So I suggest using that as a counter. As to what's going to influence Israel, eventually the truth has a way of getting through. Israeli propagandists, Israeli officials already know, and they knew this before October 7th, okay? They said openly, our main support in the United States does not come from the Jewish community. Our main support comes from the right-wing evangelical Christian community, okay? They were saying that before October 7th. And I do happen to listen to one particular Christian Zionist outlet, and boy, I mean, don't get me started on that. But that's been the case for quite some time. So,
Thank you.
thanks.